morning, everybody. My name is Linda Phippen, and I'm going to be participating in the service today. And first, I have a welcome for everybody who's joining us here in the sanctuary at our church, as well as those of you who are joining us on YouTube and who may be watching on YouTube later. We're glad you're all here. We welcome people of all kinds, shapes, sizes, and beliefs, and you're all welcome here. So I do have a few announcements. So for those of you watching on YouTube, these will also be up on the screen for you to follow along. So for coffee hour, we are doing coffee hour here in the sanctuary today. So please, if you're here, join us for coffee and some conversation afterwards. There's a lot going on in the world. I'm sure people have a lot of things they'd like to talk about. And each Sunday after service, we have that. And today, we have a special thing. We have yoga with Bridget. Bridget is here. So once we get the sanctuary cleared out a little bit, we'll have yoga with Bridget. People have been enjoying that a lot. It's for people of all abilities. So if you're here, you're welcome to participate in that. Okay. Next Monday, or the second Monday of every month, is the monthly lunch for that we go out to have a meal together. The next one will be on July 11th. It's at 11:30 at Aubrey's in Cedar Bluff up on Middlebrook Pike. So if you do plan to attend, please contact Judy Burgett or Diane Gray and let them know so they can make a reservation accurately. We do have evening conversation periods, 2 of them a week. They're on Zoom, and the one on Wednesday evenings at 6:30 is Thinking About Theology. We have very interesting conversations that start with theology and go in many directions. It's a very rewarding and interesting thing. We welcome everybody to participate. You don't have to have been coming or sign up or anything. Just look for the Zoom link in the newsletter. There's also an ongoing Thursday evening conversations, which also have been very productive and interesting. That's also a Zoom meeting from 6:30 to 8 on Thursday evenings, and the link is in the newsletter. So Reverend Carol has been leading Earth Magic meetings, one monthly meeting around the time of the new moon. The next one will be at July 31st. It's here at the church outdoors, and it's an earth-centered gathering and sharing of experience, and have some time for food and fellowship afterwards. So of course this is all weather permitting. Looking a little bit farther into the future, there will be Spirit Quest 2022, which will be held at the Elkmont Group Camp in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It will be from Friday, August 5th through Monday, August 8th. The cost is $25 per person, and you do need to bring your own camping equipment for that. So there is more information about this if you'd like to get some more information, and a registration link in the newsletter. And I think that's it for announcements. Anybody else have any announcements they'd like to make? So Sandra is going to play some gathering music. So David Howell is going to get things going for the rest of our service by sounding the Tibetan singing bowl.
So if you were introduced into a state of contemplation, quietude by the music, take a deep breath, relax, focus yourself, and listen.
So David is going to light the chalice as I have these words from Madeleine L'Engle, who you may know as the author of A Wrinkle in Time. She says, "But unless we are creators, we are not fully alive." What do I mean by creators? Not only artists, whose acts of creation are the obvious ones of working with paint or clay or words. Creativity is a way of life, a way of living life, no matter our vocation or how we earn our living. Creativity is not limited to the arts or having some kind of important career. Now I'm going to invite the choir up to sing Wake Now My Senses. David's going to have some preliminary words to our service.
I just wanted to start with an apology. This is a presentation by Linda and I, and that I'm the only name who appears on the front is not my fault. It just happened in the way in which things got printed out. But I apologize to Linda, and she was very gracious about it, since she doesn't have big ego problems. In any case, she will talk, and then she and I will converse a bit, and then we will have the offering, and then I will talk for a while. We will converse a bit, and then we can all converse a bit if we would like to, in a creative way as we know how to do.
So those of you who were last week, you will have heard Reverend Carol's service based on the book, The Artist's Way. And during that service, she asked people if any of them considered themselves to be artists. There were maybe one or two reluctant hands popped up, and then said, well, any of you are closet artists? And a few more hands popped up. But really, it's my belief that creativity lives in everyone. From your earliest childhood years, you hand a toddler a crayon and they'll scribble something. And they'll babble to themselves, they'll make up songs and imaginary friends. So the creative part is there. So what happens? Why don't we practice as much creativity when we're adults? And I have some ideas about just why that might be, and I'm going to illustrate them by something that I think may be familiar to any of you. Surely, if any of you have taken high school or college French, you've probably had this book or some version of it. It's The Little Prince in French by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And it's an easy book to read in French, so this is usually a starting text for French learners. So Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was an interesting person, and when he tells this story, writes this story of the Little Prince, a lot of it is autobiographical. And he starts out by saying in the story that when he was a little boy, he had a book called The Wild Forest. And in this book, he saw an illustration of a boa constrictor swallowing an animal whole. And the book explained that when the snake had eaten this animal whole, it had to take some time to digest it, and there would be a bump in the middle of the snake where the unfortunate digesting creature was. So he took it upon himself to draw a picture of a snake digesting something. So it was a tube with a bump in the middle and the tube extending further on. And he took this illustration that he had drawn, this picture that he had drawn, to his father and said to his father, "Look at my drawing. Doesn't it frighten you?" And his father said, "Frighten me? Why should I be frightened of a hat?" And he said, no, it's not a hat. It's a boa constrictor digesting an elephant. So to make things even clearer, he actually drew the elephant inside the snake and then showed it to his father. He said, "See, it's a boa constrictor digesting an elephant." And his father tells him, basically, don't waste your time doing silly things like this. You need to concentrate on serious things like history and geography and math and science. So anyway, he says, the little boy says, "So at the age of 6 years, I abandoned my life as a magnificent painter." But what he did do was he decided that geography he did study that, and it served him well because he became a pilot. And he was very famous for being a pilot both before and during World War II, where he unfortunately met his death. But the story goes on after this incident in his childhood of talking when he was older, when he was a pilot flying across the Sahara Desert, and his plane developed engine problems, and he had to land it. And it was nighttime, so he had to wait till the next day to start the repairs on his plane. But in the early morning, he was awakened by a little voice saying to him, "Please, draw me a sheep." And he said, woke up and said, "What?" and rubbed his eyes a little bit, and there was this little person standing there who said, "Draw me a sheep." And kind of not knowing what else to do, he grabbed his notebook and a pen, and he drew a sheep. And the little prince looks at the sheep, and he said, "No, that one looks sick. Draw another one." So he drew another sheep, and he showed it to the little prince, who said, "No, that one has horns. It's a ram. I don't want that kind of sheep. Draw me another one." So he drew his third sheep and showed it to the little prince, who said, "That one looks sick. I don't think it will, that looks too old. It won't not live long enough. I want a sheep that lives a long time." So finally, in exasperation, the narrator draws a box with 3 holes in the side, shows it to the prince and said, "Here's a crate, the sheep's inside it." And the little prince says, "That's perfect, that's exactly what I wanted." Okay, so what does this little story say about creativity and the barriers to creativity? And the first barrier is what I call the outer critic. Clearly his father in this story that denigrates his drawing and tells him to stop doing creative things like that and concentrate on serious things. So we certainly have faced outer critics. And I remember my mother telling me this story about a childhood event in her life where she had drawn a picture, as it happens, of an elephant, and showed it to her father, who said, "What's that? It looks like a flea." And I don't know if she stopped drawing at that point, but she certainly never carried on any similar pursuits as an adult. But the thing that really struck me about it was when she told me the story when I was old enough to remember it, so she had to be in her 30s, well into her 30s by then. So she had remembered this childhood incident for decades. So the outer critic can be a very powerful force. But there's also what I call the inner critic, and which is often reinforced by the outer critic too, or what you've experienced with that outer critic. But I know I find from my favorite creative pursuit, at least right now, is watercolor painting. And I'll often start and do some kind of a little painting, and I'll have a vision in my head of what I think it should look like. And I'll get partway through the painting or go all the way to the end, and I'll say, well, that didn't turn out. That is not exactly what I wanted. It's not what I wanted at all. I'm going to just rip it up and throw it away. But, you know, I, at some point along the line, said, maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I should just set this aside. And so that's what I do. I set it aside. I don't look at it for, preferably until I've forgotten it, but at least a week or two. Set it aside, don't look at it, and then when you do look at it later, you will probably have forgotten what it was you were trying to do, and you'll look at something and say, well, I don't remember what I didn't like about this. So I try to practice that. But the inner critic is a powerful force as well. And one of the other things that struck me about this story is what it says about what we call thinking outside the box. So clearly the narrator, which I think it's kind of ironic, he thought outside the box by actually thinking inside the box when he drew the crate for the sheep. And the other thing about this story is that Saint-Exupéry, though he did not become an artist, he did become this intrepid pilot and an author of several well-known books as well. And he lived his life creatively, regardless of his experiences with his unfortunate drawing of the serpent, the boa constrictor, and the elephant. So I'm going to
Yes.
we're going to do the offering now, right?
No, we're going to have to show the conversation first. That's not officially in there, but that's what we're going to do.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your creative input.
So when you told the story, Linda, about the father who said, that doesn't look like, and the kind of stultifying effect that had. The first thing that happened to me was I remembered my father, who is my hero, who I remember as far back as I can remember. He kept saying, David, you can do it. And he put me in charge of things. Sometimes it worked out well, sometimes it worked out badly. But the message he gave me was, figure it out for yourself. He created a rebel in doing that, because I always figured things out for myself. So you have the parent who does this to you. Where does the inner voice come from?
Well, I think it's I think it comes partly from your personality, and it probably varies in various degrees in terms how perfectionistic your personality is.
Please use the microphone.
Sorry, thank you. Thought I was. So I think it comes partly from your personality. I think some people have more perfectionistic tendencies and will be more self-critical than others, but I think it's there a little bit in all of us. I think we all have, when we start to do something, I think we all have an idea of what it is we're trying to do, and we'll measure the results with how well they coincide with what we thought we were trying to do.
Yes, so why do you think it doesn't, can everybody hear me? Why don't you think it doesn't happen more profitably? Why is this inner voice so powerful?
Well,
I'll use this.
I don't know. I guess there's I think an inherent fear of failure that we're graded all through school, and you don't want to fail a test, you don't want to fail anything, so you do have a fear of failure.
Yeah, and getting it right means getting the way some outside authority says it's right, particularly when you're a young child.
Mm-hmm. But that criticism from the outside, I think, really fosters this inner critic, inner criticism, and fear of failure.
When you told the story about painting and then ripping it up and then you decide to keep it, I don't paint, I do write. And I have thrown away piles of stuff because when I write it, it just seems so awful to me that no one could possibly be interested in it. I'd like your advice. Just put it away and maybe I'll look again and say, I thought I knew what I was trying to say, but obviously I didn't because this is what came out. Maybe there's some good stuff there. Does that work with painting as well?
Oh yeah, and actually, even if I look at a painting, especially a friend of mine, she also paints, and we talk a lot, and she says that one of the things that she does a similar thing. If she doesn't like the way something has turned out, she sets it aside and gets it out, and it may be that it really didn't work, but there might be one little part of it that's great. So she will take that little part and make a card out of it, or a bookmark, or something else. And I think that's true of everything. If you're certainly true of writing. If you've written something and it doesn't, I like to write too, but if it doesn't sound right, if you set it aside and come back and say, well, it didn't work, but this part of it was good. Let's take that and I'll build on that. So,
as I was listening to you, this is an incredibly sad story, that as little children, we are so creative, and we have to be, because we're making up stuff all the time, we're learning all the time, we're trying new things all the time, and we do this natural. Maybe the stuff we create isn't all that great, but at least it is ours, and we do it. And then it's almost as if it is mostly downhill from there. What a depressing story that is.
Well, it's like, what I know is I love kids' art. I love to look at the things kids have drawn. You know what I really hate? I hate adults drawing things like they were kids' art, because they're so stilted and fakey and just, you see them a lot. Somebody will, adults drawing stick figures, and yeah, that doesn't work. So.
Yeah, so there is the outer voice and the inner voice. You said to me you were going to talk about obstacles. Are there other obstacles out there?
We have the life intervening obstacles, and that's, I think, in the artist's way, the book, The Artist's Way, is that she offers a way to get past that a little bit by having you get up in the morning and before you do anything else or think of anything else, write 3 handwritten pages. Regardless of whether you're an artist or who has an artist block, or a writer who has a writer's block, or anything, but she gave it to me because I was kind of having a stuck moment in my life when I just couldn't seem to move forward on anything, and it's easy to say, well, I don't have time to do that. But if you set aside the time in the morning, I'm not a morning person. I do it in the afternoon. I don't care what she says. But that was very helpful, and that's some way that you can get past that barrier of I have other things to do. It's like the father telling you to set aside your silly drawing and concentrate on serious things. Sometimes you need to get out and do that silly drawing or silly writing, whatever.
Okay, I'm done.
Okay. Now we'll have the offering. So we have people coming around to take a collection for the support of our church and its function in our lives and in our community.
So, second half of this. There's a very famous quote from Socrates that I bet most of you have heard: "The unexamined life is not worth living." And for me, an examined life means looking at the obstacles, looking at the influences, looking at the kind of inner voices that tell me, do this, don't do that, this is the way to do things, this is the way to go. Thank somebody for my father who gave me a different kind of message. But for a long time, I thought that what Socrates meant by that one should have an examined life, was that you went off someplace in the woods or any other place by yourself and just thought by yourself, and discovered, really after several decades, that that's not what he meant at all. What he meant was go down to the marketplace and start talking with other people. The way to examine things can sometimes be done by yourself, but it is more importantly, more profitably done when you get together with other people and listen to what they have to say and respond to them, and things develop between the two of you. That is, by the way, one of the reasons why I keep coming here. We argue about whether we're a church or not, and we argue about things like that. But it's a place that I can go in which I know I will find people who have thought about things. And when I just try out my ideas, whatever they may be, I will get some intelligent responses and things for me to think about. There is a model for this, by the way. There were a couple of Israelis, some of you may have heard of them. One is Daniel Kahneman, and the other is Tversky. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for economics, though he wasn't himself an economist. Tversky didn't win it because he was dead, and the Nobel Prize only goes to living people. And there's a book that I read in which they talked about the way in which they came up with new ideas. They would just go into a room together, or they would go off by themselves walking, and they would just try things out with each other. And as they tried things out, the other would have ideas. And out of that then would become something which was a product of the two of them. Now that's simply marvelous when it happens. I never made much money teaching, but it was certainly wonderful always to be in an academic environment where not everybody was thoughtful, but there were enough people who were, including old students of mine and so on, who would give me ideas and things to think about and questions to ask. And so when we were talking about what to do for this day, talking about creativity, and Linda had kind of volunteered, and I stuck my hand up, as I tend to do, and I said, I would like to do that with Linda, so we can talk together about creativity, because I think such an important part of creativity is not this sole genius, although it sometimes is, of course, not this sole genius, but people who get together and learn from each other. So what do you have to do to learn from someone else? Well, the first thing is surely simply to listen. I said over and over in class, talking is easy. After you've talked for a few decades, you can just get up there, as I'm doing at the moment, and talk without any problem whatsoever. Listening is hard. It's hard because you just shut it off when it's not what you wanted to hear, or you say to yourself, mostly you don't say this out loud, you say it to yourself, would you please get done so I can talk, because that, after all, is what is important. But it's not when you listen well, and one can listen to a book. One can listen to a piece of music. One can listen to a conversation. One can listen to all kinds of things. But to listen means to pay attention without any preconceived ideas of how the conversation. As I read in that book about Kahneman and Tversky, the way they talked with each other, they didn't have any preconceived conclusions that they were going to come to. They had the understanding that any conclusions, which were always just provisional, would be ones that they had gotten to by listening to each other and responding to each other. So the question really comes to be creative. There is nothing, by the way, that is more important to me. We really have one job in life, and that is to create the person that we are. When Linda talked about personality, to some extent, you can create your own personality. Believe it or not, I am not making this. I am telling the truth. When I was a teenager, I was incredibly shy, particularly around women, but just generally terribly shy. I didn't talk with anybody. But after you're in a classroom for a few decades, you pretty much have to do that. And gradually, I became more ready to, came up with a stock of questions to ask. One of my favorite questions when standing in line at the post office or the Social Security office or the driver's license office, you know, one of those places where you have to stand in line. Maybe you don't have to do that anymore, but it requires technical ability that I don't have, so I still go and stand in line. And I will turn to the person next to me and said, so what did you read together lately that was good? And people kind of look at me like, what on earth are you talking about? I said, what's a good book that you've read lately? One answer, how depressing is this, is I don't have time to read. It's like, well then, what do you have, except I put it more politely than that, what do you have time to do if you don't have time to read? Because reading is a way of listening to and trying to get a sense of other people's voices, the world that they live in, which is very different. It is a way in which the barriers between us. Linda talked about the external kind of blocking mechanism, the external voice, particularly powerful authority figures, and then the internal voice. And I think we all know, don't we, the internal voice is one that has been gradually internalized from the external voice until we know what we're supposed to say and how threatening it is. So I say I have a big ego, right? So I'm willing to try anything out because I don't care whether I'm right or wrong. Indeed, I'm happier when I'm wrong because now, which is most of the time, of course, because now somebody else can give me something new to think about, a different way of asking questions, different kinds of possible answers. This business, creativity in everyday life, this business of making yourself into who you are, rather than being made into who you are by someone else. Looping around just a bit, this is a marvelous place to do that, for we as an institution and a group really do treasure and admire that. The way in which we have to come up with your own theology, you have to come up with your own kind of understanding. That's how Unitarians began, and that is something that we have kept for a long time because it is so important to us. The answers are less important than the constant process of questioning, and the constant process of questioning is useless if it is not accompanied by a kind of listening to the possibilities. I don't go to book clubs very often. I was in one for quite a long time. And for some reason, one evening it struck me that the standard response of most people when reading and then talking about a book was to point out what was wrong with it. Aha, I found a mistake that the author made. And after listening to this over and over again, finally I'd had enough and said, don't talk about what's wrong in the book. Talk instead about the kinds of ideas that you got from it that you think you can develop now in your own direction. And that's what the book club should be about. Each of us taking what we have read, not in terms of showing how smart we are by showing how it's wrong, but instead how dumb we are and how we have had new ideas that are now presented to us. Talking between parents and children is really tough. Perhaps the toughest of all, husband and wife is somewhere up there as well, but talking with children is really hard because the story so often is exactly as Linda described. Oh, that's not good. Do something else. Well, what else? Well, the implicit message is what I would like you to do. And I think Linda is right. What I would like you to do becomes the inner voice then, and the inner critic, which is saying, I'm always trying to figure out what somebody else wants. What a recipe for disaster that is, to try to figure out what somebody else wants and do it as well as you can, and almost inevitably fail at that. Instead of the alternative, which is to be constantly in the process of creating, making who it is you are. Notice how simple that is in some ways. Again, as Linda described, to leave yourself some time to do what is known specifically as a creative activity, like painting or writing or sculpting or whatever your particular art may be. But there is an art to living, too. And that art of living is one that you can become more yourself in. Have you thought about what a strange phrase that is, becoming yourself? As if there was some kind of voice and critic out there that's saying, here is what you really are, you're supposed to become that. Talk about recipes for disaster. You don't know who you're going to be. Certainly, the greatest source to creativity is running into new circumstances. And you can live a life that is so stultified, so bound, that you don't run into new circumstances. You keep hearing the same sort of thing from the same people over and over again. How much better to hear from new people, to be open to new experiences that they come. That is the natural source of creativity and the natural source of taking some kind of charge of and responsibility for the creation of the person you are constantly in the process of becoming. Well, one can simply hope that this happens, or one can do a very creative thing, and that very creative thing is to turn to somebody, go up to somebody that you have never met before and may never meet again, and ask them questions. Mine is, what's a good book that you've read lately? Another one can be, I'm thinking of some people in here, what's the best hike that you've taken? Tell me something about where you've been. Doesn't mean that I necessarily want to go there, but it'll be another picture of the world. And that picture of the world now gives you the opportunity to create who you might become. And your personality might change, as mine has changed from a very, very shy, introverted person to those of you who know me fairly well, not at all a shy, introverted person. And it didn't happen through one sharp decision, I'm going to decide to become creative. It consisted of a lot of very small acts, which simply built upon themselves. And when they do, now you start becoming the person you really are. I'm a philosopher by trade. The person you really are. What a strange phrase that is. It should be the person that I can imagine myself being. To go back to what Linda said about little children are doing that all the time. They're imagining all sorts of things that they could be. And if they have peers who are more likely to, and parents who encourage this rather than discourage this, then it can become a kind of habit. I'm always wondering who I will be. And the person that I will be always in the process of becoming is someone who is able to respond to new circumstances and then do things so that the circumstances will of necessity become new. When my wife died, the first thing I said to myself was, I have to reinvent myself, because I'd lived with her for 45 years. And I had to reinvent the person that I was going to be. Turned out I reinvented myself in a way I never quite expected, but reinventing myself was a fascinating thing to do. And there can be almost no limits to that as long as your imagination is strong enough. That is a word, imagination, that has such a bad social connotation. To be imaginative is to just dream up what isn't there, as opposed to being realistic. What crap that is. To be imaginative is to imagine all sorts of things, who you might be, what you might be able to do, not worrying about whether some particular figure approves or disapproves of that. And as you start doing it, it gets easier to do. As long as when you listen to the inner voice, you say, shut up, I am not interested in hearing from you. I want to hear from the possibilities out there, which loops me back to where I started. The examined life. What Socrates meant by that is the self-created life. The examined life is one in which you are constantly thinking about who you might be, and although, for some of us more than others, by ourselves is a very creative place and a very safe place in some ways, in the marketplace or in the church or in line someplace, is a different kind of way and a highly creative way if you simply listen to what is possible. So I will grab this mic. It is Linda's turn to ask me questions.
Well, I'm going to turn one of your questions back to you. What's a good book that you've read recently?
I have two answers to that. One is a whole series of mysteries by a fellow who lived half of his life in Botswana and the other half of his life in Edinburgh, Scotland. And the series is called the Sunday Philosophy Club. You could see why it is that I joined that. But it is simply a series of just lovely books describing possibilities. The heroine is someone who steals her niece's boyfriend and ends up having a child with him. I haven't gotten to book 7. I think they get married in book 7. But she has always decided to make up her own life. And that is a great series. The other one I'm reading at the moment is called The Worldly Philosophers, about economists, Adam Smith and Ricardo and Malthus and Keynes and so on, and the way in which economists have made us think without ever often knowing that we're thinking it. This is the way things are. This is the economic man. And we are all, as Keynes said, slaves of some dead economist. And we do this both individually and socially.
That's an interesting combination, I have to say. The other thing I was thinking as you're talking about your long teaching career, were there any particular insights that you derived from your students and the things that they said that affected your way of thinking and perhaps your shedding of your shyness?
Partly it was simply just doing it. You just can't do it for month after month, year after year, unless you become somewhat comfortable up there. What they did more than anything were students, and I taught at Pellissippi. I really loved teaching at Pellissippi. We do not get the most literate, educated people of the world, by and large, at Pellissippi. And yet, I thought I saw in an extraordinary variety of people all kinds of potential. They would say things to me, and I would use the standard thing, you know, there are no stupid questions, blah, 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 kind of stuff. Just let them speak from their experience, which inevitably was going to be different from my experience. And I got a letter one time, which I really treasure. A young woman who had then had a child, and she said, "You opened doors for me that I didn't even know were there." I did not reply. If I had, I would have said, "And you opened doors for me that I never knew were there." The way in which one can now change your life in significant kinds of ways if you simply don't rule it out before you ever start.
That seems so true, that if you just close yourself off to hearing from things that you don't, from people that you don't think are enough like you to say things that you would be interested in, it's a way of cutting you off from a big part of life's experience.
It is an abstraction, but it's right. I mean, everybody's like me. I mean, everybody suffers pain. Everybody struggles. Life is hard. And that's which is part of the song that we sang as a choir. Life is hard. Mm-hmm. And if you're simply aware of that and don't think that you have the solutions but are ready to get together to look for them, what a creative kind of thing that is. And not to be defeated because it didn't come out the way you thought it was going to come out.
I'm curious, did you have a vision when you were, like, in that period of life, in the teen years or preteen years, did you have a vision of what you wanted to be when you grew up?
Yeah, I was going to be an engineer. Everybody, and so I went to college to become an engineer because this is in the early 50s, after all. Everybody who was going to be successful became an engineer. That's the way it is. And I discovered that I hated labs, and I never had the patience to do things carefully. And so I quit engineering, and I said, what's the most different from engineering I can think of? And the answer to that was philosophy. So I thought I would try philosophy. And so my ideas changed. You know, something else occurred to me, Linda, when you're talking about how creative little children are. There is a kind of creativity, it's one that comes from puberty and sexual tension. There's a kind of creativity in our teenage years, which is even more of an inner struggle for, I think, most kind of people.
When they start differentiating themselves from their parents and their family and forming an identity.
Yes.
Or attempting anything.
Yes, and once I gave up the idea to be an engineer, I didn't have any idea of what then I was going to be. Probably a teacher, because what else do you do with philosophy? But I also became a gardener for a while. And that was an interesting thing to do. And then the lesson really was learned. The more different kinds of things I can do, the more I'm going to have a say in creating myself, and the more I will have a variety of things to pick from.
Yeah, your story reminds me, my significant other also wanted to be an engineer when he went to college, but they were going to make him, here's the outer forces, they were going to force him to take mechanical drawing, which he did not want to do, so he just said, well, I'll be a physicist then. Same thing. It's just actually, being a scientist is actually a creative endeavor as well.
Oh, yes.
So
Yes, I
our
think
scientists in the room will
on that. Yeah.
create. So, well, maybe we have some questions from the audience here.
Since I've got this, I will walk around.
Most stimulating talk. You made me think about a lot of things. And let me just say, when she said, hold up your hands if you think you're creative, I really put my hand right up. And you got me to thinking about how that goes back to my childhood, that I would think of myself that way. But what I really want to remind people of today is something else that Carol said about that she wanted all of us to do something creative, artistic by next fall for some kind of an art show or display or program or something that apparently she's imagining in the back of her head. And she wanted us all to do something creative. Whatever you can do, paint a picture, write a song, write a poem, create a dance, whatever you yourself can think of you can do that's creative. And I just wanted to remind people of that.
Actually, apropos of that, I actually talked to Carol about this last week, because I've had in my mind that I wanted to start, we have a book club, I'd like to start an arts and crafts club. So any kind of creative thing that people are involved in, any kind of thing that's suitable for, like, we can't make jewelry, do flower arranging, make a quilt, do anything, but sit together and share our creative impulses with one another. So if any of you are interested in doing this, please let me know, and I'm going to try to get that set up.
I responded in somewhat the same way you did, of trying to widen that, because I'd been thinking about this. One of the things I immediately thought of was creativity is usually thought of as somehow the artistic production of specially gifted kind of people. And that's the main thing I wanted to talk about this morning, was that creativity doesn't need to be understood that way. It can simply be understood in the way in which you carry on your regular daily activities, but do it in a different way.
When you talked about asking people questions, for some reason, what I have 40 years as a clinical psychologist, it had never occurred to me with my kids, my adult kids, to ask them not, what are you doing? How's it working out and this stuff? But who are you trying to become? Who are you working on? Not trying, bad word. Who are you working on becoming? And I thought, damn, that would be an interesting thing to ask them. I don't remember somebody recommending that. So that's just in case that seems useful to anybody else.
And what I wanted to say to that is everybody, all our children, everybody, are working on becoming somebody. It's just a question of how they're going about it. How many restrictions? And yes, and then when you get asked, you actually have to articulate it in some way, or maybe you simply think about it in a different way.
It gives you a frame of saying this is an important thing to be doing, not it's something that maybe happens or maybe you're struggling against or whatever. It's just important. It gives it importance.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I get into this when I'm preparing for something like this. It is the important thing. I mean, nothing else really finally matters except the kind of person. Carol kind of alluded to that last week, in which she talked about as we become different as individuals, what we can do in the outer world will change. And when we do things in the outer world, it will change what we do inside as well. And that connection is there. But she just kind of mentioned the change inside each of us as separate persons, kind of tangentially, I thought, or at least that's the way I heard it. To think of it more clearly opens up possibilities.
Well, I was just thinking that, and it's not a process that ever stops. I think you're always trying or working on the person you're going to be trying to become. And I mean, I think of it as like, I'm trying to get used to what it is like to be an old person, you know? And that hopefully comes to everybody. Yeah. Well, I'm not there. Yeah, I guess I am there yet. I haven't quite accepted it, but you have to. I mean, there's always changes in what your perspective is and what your opportunities are. Every once in a while, I'll see somebody talking about some kind of a career. I thought, I might like to do that. I'm like, wait a minute. So, anyway.
Yes.
You're talking about young people, teenagers. They have imagination and they like to think of what they're going to be someday. Well, I have the opposite problem with my granddaughter, who's now 15, going on 16. It's a constant conversation we're having. She doesn't like anything. She says, I don't know what to be because I don't like anything. It's so difficult. I don't know what to say, you know. She has no imagination of what she would like to be. And she's just worried because at school, the teachers or somebody tells her, you have to know what you want to be so that we can decide which course you're going to take. Yeah, well, I say that to her too, but the problem is that she herself has no idea. She says, I don't like anything. So there's a teenager for you. Sure. Please. Because I don't know what's going on.
Well, one of the things that David made me remember about was when I was a teenager. Of course, that was the thing. What are you gonna be and everything, and. Suddenly, one day, it suddenly occurred to me, I can't tell you what I'm going to be. I am becoming. I can't know what the end result of that is going to be. I'm in the process of becoming a person, learning about the world, what's out there. It's fine that some people have made a decision already. I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to be a nurse. I'm going to whatever. But you know, I didn't. And once I had that thought. Oh, I was so relieved. I don't have to go around having decided at age 15 what I'm going to be when I'm 25. I'm just becoming, and that's okay.
I would like to add to that is religion ought to be the source of that kind of open-ended possibility, and we all know that very often religion turns out to be exactly the opposite of that, which says that this is the only way that you can be, and you better do it, and then awful stuff follows from that. I mean, when the most potential of anything that human beings had come up with, along with science, to really expand our possibilities into what our imagination can think of, has turned in practice into what is the most restrictive. That is a real shame. Yeah.
I guess I just wanted to explore the role of constraints in creativity. And I think you're talking about, I think one of the struggles when you're a teenager or when you're a young adult and you're trying to decide your career path without enough information or experience. And, you know, this is a plug for liberal arts education. But, you know, liberal arts education really just kind of pushes it down the road. And I feel like there's really a positive role of constraints where, yeah, you can call it an external critic, but if you decide on, you know, some part of what path you're going to go down, you'll find opportunities to be creative in that career, even if it might not have been the optimal solution. You know, I don't think it's necessarily going to prevent you from being creative or being happy in your career if you narrow it down up front. Because I just remember being very troubled by having to decide and not knowing what to do. as a career. So, and I think having constraints kind of helps you to be more creative. I'm not sure if I'm really explaining that very well. But if you can do anything, you're not going to do anything.
So what's the source of the constraints that you're talking about?
So you might think that, for example, being an engineer might not be creative, but actually it can be very creative. Being a programmer or anything you do, there are creative elements of it. I mean, there may be some things that there are no opportunities for creativity where it's just very rote and regimented. But I think that if you have too wide or too many options, it prevents you from progressing, and you can't really be optimally creative unless you have some constraints on what you're focusing on. Does that make sense? Like, if you're dabbling in everything, you're never going to really develop the skills in one thing to be good at it and to be able to have the tools you need to be creative.
Well, speaking as a lifelong dabbler, yeah, I was thinking when I was a kid, I wanted to be any one of a number of things: an entomologist, an astronomer, a neurosurgeon. I also wanted to live on a desert island by myself and play guitar. Obviously, I didn't do any of those things, and my career path, I ended up in a career path I liked through not having any constraints particularly.
Right, and you don't have to stay in the same career your entire life anymore.
But what you say about engineering is certainly true, and I think that's one of the things we were trying to convey in these talks, is that creativity can be, your life can be creative in many ways. It's not, you don't have to be an artist per se. You can be creative and it probably in most careers, actually, you need to be creative unless you're going to be, working on an assembly line or something. And you're going to have creative solutions to problems you find.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I'm not sure where this goes. That's the thing for me to think about. But I think you're absolutely right. Yes, I mean, the world and my abilities, and I'm not going to jump over the moon, I mean, there are constraints. To become a good anything requires a kind of dedication to doing some boring things, which I think is what your granddaughter is perhaps talking about. To think you can live just however you feel like. I don't think that's very creative either. I'm just kind of musing at the moment. This is a good thing to think about.
Mm-hmm. But you don't want to have your constraint to be like, if you wanted to be a scientist or an engineer, to have someone be telling you your math skills aren't good enough at an early age, So.
Oh, I'm thinking of a couple things thinking as a psychologist, I do that. There's a real temperament difference between people who are freed up and very comfortable with open-endedness and people who thrive with more clear limits. And there's in between, of course, but neither one is right or wrong, but just a different approach works better with different people. Also, having raised kids in here, and maybe it's the whole country, I don't know, but the kids in high school were being pushed to know what they wanted to do. The guidance counselors wanted them to. I mean, it's like, no, that's what you go to college for, hopefully, and maybe after college, you're finding out. You're 16 and you're going to know what you want to do? No. A rare person decides it, and it's a good choice as opposed to decides it, and I saw enough of those. They're a senior saying, I hate engineering. I'm there because both my parents are engineers. I hate it. What am I going to do? I saw it more often with engineering because that's, such a popular thing to be pushed, but it could be anything. And yeah, kind of giving people space for learning about the world, for being in development. We are now discovering brains are not entirely mature until people are 25 or so, which explains a lot. You know, it's important.
Just one last thing. Yes, good. Here.
I have had so many people I've known that went all the way through school trying to please their parents or whoever and came out with their degree, nursing or whatever it was, and they hated it. They just hated it. They went in the wrong direction. And they did find something else out of it. However, I know myself, because I didn't have the opportunities that a lot of my friends had, that I just had to get a job. It wasn't like, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? It was just like, I don't know. Do I have a choice? I've got to get a job. And what I found was the jobs I got along the way, how low level they were, I just found what I liked about them and moved up from there. And then tried to get the education that would correspond with what I found I liked about it. And eventually, what I found is I like numbers, and I became an accountant. But sometimes people don't have choices, and I think the only option for those people or those children to keep their mind open and expanded is to get them their first job, or get them some volunteer opportunities, or get them into the animal shelter to help, or get them into certain organizations where they can start getting a taste of what people do for a living, instead of being told what is a righteous and just and financially good way to go through life. Because sometimes you're doing all of that just to please someone else.
You know, we're starting to run a little bit long, so we may have to wrap up questions, and maybe we've got coffee hour after to stand around and chat about these issues. And I think before we go, I think Dave has some closing words. Do you?
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
It's written down right here. Says you've got some closing words. So.